Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, of a very special guest. His name is David Smith. We have talked in the past. We talked about Andre Puharich, and I was very well received. Not a lot of people knew much about Puharich, but he reached out to me and said he'd been doing a lot of work on the Dulles brothers, the two brothers. John Foster Dulles is the older one, Alan the younger one, who left their impact upon America, really world politics, World War One, after World War Two, or during World War Two and after World War Two, under the Eisenhower administration. There's a lot to talk about. Like you could do probably 15-part episodes, 15 episodes on these two guys. But we're going to try to cover some of the stuff that not a lot of people know about. And David Smith's podcast is Bad Press Podcast. So I'll put a link to his podcast. He also has a Hemispheric Press. But David Smith, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much for having me. Excited to be back. I really enjoyed the last one, so I'm looking forward.
I did too.
Looking forward to this.
Yeah. So for people who didn't hear our last one, maybe you can talk about your background, your interest, your podcast, and then why you got interested in the Dulles brothers.
Yeah, so I had a little bit more of kind of a mainstream history research background. Nothing too intense, but I have an undergraduate degree in history. And kind of while I was kind of in those studies, I focused a lot on Central American Cold War history. And that topic led me directly to get interested in the Dulles brothers because I was especially interested in Guatemala, and I was interested in the overthrow of the Arbenz government and the coup that was sponsored by the CIA in 1954. And how United Fruit Company, which later became Chiquita Banana, how intimately involved they were with that coup. And as you kind of, very early on in that research, you learn that Alan Dulles was the director of the CIA at that time. You learn that John Foster Dulles, his older brother, was the Secretary of State. This was during the Eisenhower administration. So they're kind of directly, those are the two kind of two offices that would be most responsible for a coup, overthrowing a foreign government. And then you begin to learn that they worked as lawyers for Sullivan and Cromwell, who represented United Fruit Company during the original land negotiations in Guatemala, kind of in the late 30s, early 40s. So it becomes very clear early on that the Dulles brothers are major players in the Guatemalan coup, and then they have kind of their hands in all of these other foreign affairs. We'll talk a little bit about the Iranian coup, the Bay of Pigs. That was kind of Alan Dulles's baby, an idea that he had kind of hatched. So all this stuff with Central America and Latin America, Cold War, the Dulles brothers are huge. Especially in the 50s. And when you start looking into the Dulles brothers' background, there's a ton of interesting stuff. With Sullivan and Cromwell, that law firm. We'll talk pretty extensively about them because it's maybe one of the most, I'd say maybe the most powerful law firm in the history of the world. Certainly one of the most powerful in American history. And during their work for them, they are extremely close with German businesses in the interwar period. They provided a lot of funding for some pretty terrible corporations during the rise of the Nazis, and their family, the Dulles family connections go way back. So yeah, it's a huge topic. Like you said, there could be, you could have endless hours of podcasts. So we'll try and kind of hit the highlights and focus in on some lesser known stuff.
They come from a story. John Foster's named after his grandfather, right, who was Secretary of State. So they come from a family who was around the government, right?
Yeah, that's John W. Foster, I believe was the Dulles brothers. So it's going to get confusing with names because John W. Foster is the name of the grandfather. So we'll call him Grandpa John. Grandpa John was the Dulles brothers. It was their mother's father. And he was the Secretary of State for Benjamin Harrison in 1892 and 1893. And so he didn't have a super long tenure as Secretary of State, but he was busy while he was there. And he was actually responsible for organizing the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarch and kind of the official annexation of Hawaii. Not, they didn't become a state, while he was around, but we did.
The state didn't happen until the 50s, but the U.S. basically, crowbarred it out of control of whoever was controlling it, took
Yeah,
the property.
yeah, it was Queen Lily Uokalani, I believe is how you would pronounce it. And that she was the Hawaiian monarch, and Hawaii was an independent state at that point. And so they had entered into trade agreements with the United States. They had entered into trade agreements with other, with other nations kind of in Asia. It's a critical junction between Asia and the United States, the middle of the Pacific, super strategic location. But they, like I said, they had been recognized as an independent state, and we had entered into treaties with them. And Sanford Dole, the patriarch of the kind of ubiquitous Dole Fruit Company, he was the one that kind of led the coup, but the United States actually supported the overthrow of the monarch with Marines. So they landed Marines on the beach to help Sanford Dole and kind of his team seize power. And so it kind of became, a banana republic. And the word banana republic actually comes from Guatemala because it was, bananas were the central export of Guatemala. But
United Fruit Company, right?
Yeah. And like I said, we'll talk about them because that was one of the things that I've looked quite a bit into and been researching for over 10 years now. But Hawaii kind of became this banana republic led by Sanford Dole before banana republics were, I guess, really even a thing. So it's that parallel is really fascinating to me, that the Dulles brothers' Grandpa John, had overseen the overthrow of a government and given control directly to the leader of this massive fruit corporation. It's one of those things that you don't necessarily, like, when you think of like big evil empires, like corporate empires, you don't necessarily think of fruit companies, but they were extremely active, especially in Central America and in different places like Hawaii as well.
You got a question already. Jug the Goat asks, "What's up, guys? What are some good books to learn about these guys? They're involved in everything. I'm not sure." Yeah, one is by Kinzer, right? It's called the Dulles Brothers, right?
Yeah, Stephen Kinzer. I think it might be called The Brothers.
The Brothers.
As far as if you want to know, especially about Alan Dulles, The Devil's Chessboard by David Talbot.
Yes.
I've read really, really good book. He's the David Talbot, I think, started Salon magazine, but he was able to actually.
Book. Yeah, it's a fantastic book.
Yeah, he was able to get access into. I think that there is a like Dulles library at Princeton, and I think he was able to kind of get access to some records that had previously not been available to the public. So those are those I would like start with those two. I also think that there is a book that is specifically about Sullivan and Cromwell, and I believe it's called A Law Unto Itself. And to understand kind of the Dulles brothers, I really think you need to understand a little bit about the history, or a lot of it about the history of the law firm they worked for. So, and there's really not that many books about specifically about Sullivan and Cromwell. It's the only one that I've been able to find that's dedicated solely to the history of that law firm.
If you can find it at all, right?
Yeah,
it's like one of the great suppressed books of all time. A Law Unto Itself: The Untold Story of the Law Firm Sullivan and Cromwell. 100 years of creating power and wealth. So you can't even find that on a shelf in a library. I don't even think you can buy it off Amazon. Yeah.
No, I think I had to go find a PDF of it, and I'm not even sure if that PDF was like you can just look it up online. I think I had to kind of dig around for it. But yeah, if you're looking for kind of a quote unquote banned book, that's that's a really revelatory one.
And I mean, that is itself the reason, the importance of Sullivan and Cromwell is that they were the corporate overlords for all these, they call it a white shoe firm, all of these huge corporations, including Standard Oil, right? And U.S. Steel and all this stuff.
Yeah, so I can talk a little bit about the history of Sullivan and Cromwell. So it was started by two guys named Algernon Sidney Sullivan, William Nelson Cromwell. Started in 1887. They set up shop directly across from the New York Stock Exchange, and they specialized in corporate law. So they would rescue struggling companies. They would form new companies, and they would merge companies together. So they were especially active in, kind of like forming mergers. And so one of the notable companies that they started early in their history was the Edison General Electric Company. So kind of right off the bat, they're involved with one of the most major utility companies in the United States. One of the things that they did very early on that completely changed global economics forever was they lobbied the New Jersey government to set up extremely favorable corporate laws. And they were basically responsible for getting the legislature passed in New Jersey. And for the first time, one company could hold stock in another company. And so this led to the creation of holding companies. And the reason that they set up this legislation is because it allowed corporations to work around the antitrust and anti-monopoly laws that had been enacted in the 19th century. So there's always kind of this war, between massive corporations and the government, and the government would try and curb, power and try and break up monopolies. But there's, these companies would always try and find loopholes in that. And so Sullivan and Cromwell incorporated U.S. Steel in 1901 under the supervision of J.P. Morgan. And U.S. Steel was a conglomerate that brought together Carnegie Steel, Federal Steel, and National Steel at a value of $18 billion in today's dollars. And this company produced around 2/3 of the nation's steel in the early 20th century. And they also, like I said, they were involved with the most powerful utility companies in the country. They helped Union Electric establish over 1,000 subsidiary companies to get a stranglehold on the production and distribution of electricity. And that's just, a couple of their clients. I mean, you want to talk about major corporations, I would say at least 60 to 70% of them at one time have had Sullivan and Cromwell on the payroll. And then I don't know if you want to talk a little bit. They were also involved with the construction of the Panama Canal.
Yeah, it's very important to actually talk about that.
Yeah, so there was a French client of theirs who had purchased land in Panama, and there was kind of this, I think it was a private, the French government may have, contributed a little bit of money, but there was this private French corporate interest to build a canal across Panama. But the deal fell through with the Panamanian government, and the company was in danger of going under. They were, about to declare bankruptcy. Meanwhile, the United States had a separate plan, kind of a parallel plan, to dig a canal through Nicaragua. And Sullivan and Cromwell intervened before they were about to finalize the plan to build the canal in Nicaragua, and they convinced the United States government to actually purchase the land from their French client. So the reason that the Panama Canal was built in Panama, not Nicaragua, was because Sullivan and Cromwell intervened, and they helped save this French client of theirs from going under, because it was a massive deal. I forget the number.
It's a huge interest. I mean, there's a huge amount of corporate and monetary interest in making that canal happen. By the way, people who don't know, Panama didn't exist, so it was actually part of Colombia. They actually created a new country. And basically just strong-armed them. Basically, it was kind of like Teddy Roosevelt said, we're going to take this land. So Panama really, as a country, is independent because of the United States and Sullivan and Cromwell and all these guys.
Well, and we talked about like that, kind of creation of holding companies, and, where, like, what is Panama, best known for, maybe other than the canal, is it's a, corporate safe haven for, tax breaks and all that, all that kind of offshore, funneling, assets into, they just have
Panama
random
papers.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, and that just gives you, it's just a, a taste, like, Sullivan and Cromwell is kind of its own its own beast to tackle. But this was before the Dulles brothers were working. All of this was pre-Dulles brothers involvement. But when the Dulles brothers get involved, they're going to especially become interested in German investment. And that German investment would be kind of in the interwar period. But yeah, just to talk a little bit about the background of the Dulles brothers. So like I said, their grandfather had been the Secretary of State for Benjamin Harrison, and they spent a lot of time with their grandfather. So very early in their lives, their grandfather, after he was the Secretary of State, he became he became like a diplomat, and also just he was advocating for U.S. business interests in foreign countries. So he became especially involved in China and some of these other critically strategic markets for the United States. But he was still, a major power player in Washington, and so he would have Teddy Roosevelt over for dinner. He would have foreign ambassadors over for dinner. And so I think by the time, the Dulles brothers were of age, it's like they had met 2 or 3 U.S. presidents. They had met all of these foreign ambassadors. So they were in these circles of power. They were having these conversations from a very early age. But it's interesting because their father was he was a simple, like, Presbyterian minister. And so there was kind of this, they weren't poor because they had the support of their family and the support of their grandfather, but their, like, father himself, like, he didn't take it, he wasn't, he married into the mother's side, which was kind of the power player side. And he came from kind of like a much more austere background. But
I think they're from upstate New York. Yeah. So they're not quite in the, what do they call it? The Gilded Age. They're kind of like footmen for the Gilded Age in a way.
Yeah. They were from Watertown, I believe, Watertown, New York. And, so they would kind of force their way into, the upper echelons of American society, kind of as they worked on their connections. But, their I guess their quote unquote, like, their bloodline wasn't necessarily, one of the old rich families from the colonies. Or
keep talking for a couple minutes. I'll be right back.
Yeah, absolutely. So both of the Dulles brothers, they ended up attending Princeton. And so John Foster Dulles was he was the more conservative of the two in terms of his personal life. He was much more religious than his younger brother Alan was. Like I said, their father was a Presbyterian minister, and John Foster Dulles kind of embodied that Protestant conservatism, hardworking. He was known as kind of a workaholic, keep his head down, very faithful and dedicated to his wife, but, also very, more so committed to work. Whereas Alan was kind of the party boy, much more into drinking, much more into sleeping around, he's kind of notorious for, having multiple mistresses and being very out in the open with it. So you kind of had, they had very different personalities, and they would always work together, but they did kind of clash in that way. They weren't, they weren't twins in the sense that they, were robotically in step or anything like that. And you would kind of see that in the careers that they choose. So John Foster, becoming the Secretary of State, and Alan Dulles becoming the director of the CIA. The CIA was kind of this rogue, like, sexy intelligence organization, whereas the Secretary of State was much more of kind of that, formal office of power. But they were both able to actually, so we mentioned their grandfather was the Secretary of State for Benjamin Harrison. They had another family member who was the Secretary of State for Woodrow Wilson. And his name was Robert Lansing. And I believe it was their mother's brother. But yeah, Robert Lansing was the Secretary of State for Woodrow Wilson during World War I. And so he was, kind of instrumental in a lot of, like, getting the United States into the war, and especially getting them into the war on the side of Great Britain. And then after the war, he was, the Secretary of State would have been responsible for sending a delegation to the Treaty of Versailles to draw up the peace negotiations for the aftermath of World War I. And so both Dulles brothers actually had an opportunity to go with that delegation to the Treaty of Versailles and work on behalf of the State Department. John Foster kind of took a more, I guess, important role in those negotiations, where he was negotiating German war reparations. And he favored, as well as the Wilson administration favored, more lenient reparations for Germany than France, specifically France, wanted. So he thought, instead of just absolutely burying Germany and rubbing their nose into the dirt, that they should focus on rebuilding Germany, investing in Germany, and trying to kind of rebuild it in more of like, rebuild it to a power where they could, do business with them. At the core, at his core, John Foster was he was a businessman, and so he was constantly worried about, okay, how do we invest in markets, and how do we make more money, and how do we he thought that the road to global peace is through trade, and so he was in favor of that. But obviously we kind of lose out in that conversation because France and Great Britain side with way more harsh penalties for Germany, and they set up a reparation structure that does completely bury Germany and creates extreme economic hardship in that country, in the early 20s into the Great Depression. So that's what John Foster was doing at the Treaty of Versailles. And then Allen Dulles was helping to draw boundaries for some of the Eastern European countries. And so there had been a lot of empires that fell after World War I. There was the Ottoman Empire and, a couple of the other like Eastern European power players, that had begun to crumble. And so there was the formation of these, newer states, and they needed to draw borders for them. And so Allen Dulles is kind of involved in that process. But again, you see kind of like they're very early, and this would have been very early in their careers, kind of when they're in their 20s, they're sitting at these, having these really important conversations, talking with some of the most important diplomats from France, Great Britain, and the likes. So.
Right. So they're just in the mix of everything post-war. I mean, this is the foundation of World War II. And some historians have argued that it's just one big war, World War I and II, because it's all the same power. So, and because of the harshness of the Treaty of Versailles that World War II happened, in my opinion. So the foundation of the Second War was made at the end of the first one, which is incredible.
Yeah, and it's like the United States has always had kind of this isolationist, especially in the 19th century and early 20th centuries, we had this isolationist approach to European affairs. And so we were reluctant to get involved with World War I. It takes stuff like the sinking of the Lusitania and the Zimmerman Note for us to get involved. So we drag our feet into World War I. We're on the winning side. But then in terms of drawing up the peace, we revert back to that isolationist tendency. And Woodrow Wilson, famously wanted to start, I guess it was called the League of Nations back then, but he famously wanted to start, the United Nations, and he wanted to have an international diplomatic structure to try and avoid, things like World War I happening. But the United States Congress, especially the Republican Party at that time, they voted it down. They voted they would not ratify the League of Nations. So the organization that was proposed to stop the next World War, the United States, proposed it, Woodrow Wilson did, and then our own Congress wouldn't ratify it. So, it shows how kind of reluctant we were to continue on engaging with kind of European affairs. And, in hindsight, it looks like, that was perhaps a mistake. But then, as we'll see, we go completely the other direction after World War II, and we are anti-isolationists, and we have our, hands in everything. And so the isolationists, I guess, would look at that and say, well, this is what we warned you about. This is why we didn't want to get involved. And the Dulles brothers are actually, in large part responsible for, kind of this global military intelligence apparatus that, we kind of have been seeing for the last 75, 80 years. So it's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, you have to put them in there as this kind of like world controllers or something. Like the Dulles family ran American foreign policy probably from post-war till when Kennedy fired him in '61. It was also there was a famous sister too. Her name was. You ever heard of Eleanor Lansing Dulles?
Yeah,
Yes.
um, there's a really interesting story that she tells about Alan, and I think she was much closer with Alan than John Foster. Or maybe it was the other way around. She kind of saw John Foster as maybe more of like this father figure, and she was like a little bit more personally closer to Alan. But she tells this story of when they were kids, and she was younger, and she was struggling to swim, and she ended up, kind of sinking, and she was drowning, and she was screaming for help. And she remembers like looking at her brother on the shore, who was at this point, very able, he was a very able swimmer, and he just sat there and kind of looked at her and like let her struggle. And then after, quite a few seconds of that and her panicking, he started to call out and like scream. And their mother, who suffered from migraines, was laying down in the house. She had to like run out of the house full sprint and dive into the lake fully clothed to like rescue their daughter. But Eleanor would go on to like talk about it, made like a huge imprint on her, as a child. But I don't know
That
a
was
ton
his
about her.
nickname. His nickname was the Shark. There were a shark, or people thought of him as a shark. So, not really a warm and cuddly nickname by any chance.
Yeah, he was definitely the more. I mean, like I said, I don't know like what kind of. There's a lot of words you can use to describe Alan Dulles, but I mean, there was a little bit of like psychopath in there,
Yeah,
and
sinister
that
figure, very sinister figure, and very will, power of the will, and a womanizer. Like he was married, but like he would brag that like he had sex with 1,000 women, like a rock star or something like that. Like that was
yeah,
his
he
thing.
yeah, he loved like he thought it was very, that's kind of like why he liked the world of espionage, is he thought, it was a very, that it was a very sexy thing to go and tell women that he was, a spy, and that he was, involved in all of this covert action. And he wasn't the kind of spy that stayed in the shadows. He was very out in the open, even when he was the OSS station chief in Bern, during World War II. Like he openly advertised that he was, the station chief for the OSS, and he would, host parties at his house in Bern and meet with contacts. He was not worried about being covert in a lot of his actions, and he liked kind of that the attention of the press. The press would write articles about him, and he kind of liked that spotlight. So yeah, and then yeah, famously, and I know that I think you mentioned this in our last episode, but famously he had Mary Bancroft as one of his mistresses.
Right.
And it was strange because his wife, like he said, he never did anything behind closed doors. He was very open about it, and he would tell his wife, um, that he was having all of these affairs. And his wife actually became friends with Mary Bancroft, and I think it was like they both were seeing Carl Jung
Yeah.
at one point, and but it was strange that his wife and his mistress had a friendship, and they were both kind of like could not figure out the enigma that was Alan Dulles. But
And it was her
we get,
best friend that she traveled around the 30th. That was Ruth Forbes Payne, who Michael Payne was like literally there at the JFK assassination. Like these are really close connections.
yeah, that's what we had touched on.
It gets confusing because there's a Ruth Payne, but there's a different one, Ruth Forbes Payne, who is
Yeah,
the age of Dulles.
yeah, and that was Arthur Young's. It
Right.
was like
Eventually his
her,
wife too, right?
yes, I think her second husband was Arthur Young. And at the time of the JFK assassination, that was like, yeah, Ruth Forbes Young, yeah, was the mother, and then Ruth Forbes Payne was the daughter, and Ruth Forbes Payne was the one that was in Dallas.
No, but Michael Payne's important because he's the direct son. there were, I mean, I was reading through some of the JFK stuff recently, and he is there. Like when they brought Oswald in after he was arrested, he was there on November 22nd, 1963 in the cop's place. So you
Yeah.
literally had the direct son. So people, the thing is that Ruth Payne is a very important figure, but her husband's just, he's one of those people who was like almost like a spy, like, oh, he's just the guy who's the ex-husband. He's not around. That's not true. He was
Yeah.
on site for the JFK assassination.
Yeah, that's what, and like you said, it does get really confusing with all of the names and then that whole thing. But it was, yeah, I mean, they're 100%. They were all tied up in that JFK assassination. We'll look, like I said, we'll get to the JFK assassination and kind of how Dulles is, directly, kind of a linchpin in that whole, in that whole affair. He's right in the thick of all of it. So yeah, but that's kind of getting a little bit ahead.
Arbenz. I mean, the whole thing, like people look past these Arbenz. The U.S. meddling in the Central America goes back to post-war, and the early one is 1953, right? So, like we talk about Iran Contra, it's a constant meddling since World War II, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what I mean. We can talk about that, or we can talk about the Sullivan and Cromwell, like their ties to the Nazis. Before, and I guess we can go kind of in chronological order. So we'll go with the Nazis first, and then we can spend a lot of time on the Arbenz stuff because that's super interesting. But both the brothers kind of after this, World War I, after they're part of like this Versailles Treaty peace process, they both go on to work for, I think they were actively working for Sullivan and Cromwell then, but they rise through the ranks at Sullivan and Cromwell, and they become increasingly connected with German business interests in the interwar period. So right after the Treaty of Versailles, John Foster takes a trip. He took a trip to Germany to evaluate the political and economic climate of the war-ravaged nation, and feeling bad for what he perceived as a raw deal for the reparations arrangement, John Foster was committed to re-stimulating trade for the German economy through private investment. And so on this trip, he actually witnesses the Kapp Putsch, which is a right-wing revolt in Germany immediately following World War I. He remarks in letters on the rising anti-Semitism in the country, but he is most afraid of the communist threat in Germany. So following World War I, you kind of have two extreme sides. You have the fascists on the right and you have the communists on the left, and you have this really weak government in the center, and both of the extremes are trying to seize power. And so he becomes aware of all of this right-wing activity and the fascism that's starting to spring up, but he's also much more concerned with communism. And this is a really critical thing to understand about the Dulles and to understand about the Cold War in general is, I think a lot of times it's like we talk about the Red Scare and we talk about, like how communism is the worst, but really digging into why the Dulles brothers would be so afraid of communism, it's because they work for Sullivan and Cromwell, and they work for the biggest corporate law firm in the world. And communism is a direct threat, especially to these major corporations. And so, when you talk about who is threatened the most by communism, you have your average Joe who doesn't like communism and hates the Reds, but the people most threatened by communism are, the elite owners of business, because that's who is, going to have their businesses threatened if the state, seizes control. And so that's just like very, like even before World War II happens, even before, the rise of the Nazis, like they are very, very concerned with communism because the Bolshevik Revolution happens during World War I. And so they are especially paying attention to the communist threat in Germany. And that's why they want to kind of get these German businesses on their feet, and they want to re-stimulate trade so that, they can have a buffer against any communist rise to power. And so while he is taking this trip through Germany, Alan actually joins him, and they meet with this guy named Hjalmar Schacht, who is a German economist, and he is someone who would actually end up in the Nuremberg trials for war crimes. And they would maintain a relationship with Schacht throughout the interwar period. And he was one of their point people for funneling private investment into Germany. And so the way that they kind of funneled this investment into Germany was through something called the Dawes Plan. And so Sullivan and Cromwell funneled hundreds of millions of dollars in loans to private German companies. They also represented some very suspicious clients in Germany. They set up a German wing of the law firm called Albert and Westrick. Heinrich Albert had actually been a spy for the Germans in World War I, and he had tried to cripple the U.S. chemical manufacturing industry. That was his job, was to kind of like, in some way take down U.S. chemical manufacturers. He failed at that, but he was still working as a spy for the Germans when they were our enemy. And then Westrick would make headlines in the United States when he visited. So that was one side of the law firm that was part of Sullivan and Cromwell, was Heinrich Albert. The other one, Westrick, would make headlines in the United States when he visited the Waldorf Astoria Hotel and hosted a huge party designed to recruit support for the Nazis among the American business class in 1940. So this was after the invasion of Poland, before the United States had entered the war, but actively when they were, attacking our allies like Great Britain. And this German wing of the firm, Albert and Westrick, represented the companies Kodak, Ford, General Motors, and ITT, all of which are kind of notorious Nazi collaborators. So it's, like I said, those, you have those four companies. What's even worse is Sullivan and Cromwell helped turn IG Farben, arguably the most notorious company of the Nazi regime, into the atrocity we witnessed during World War II. The Dulles brothers were critical in arranging a deal between IG Farben and the International Nickel Company, which was basically the world's sole supplier of nickel. And nickel is an essential metal in war production. So the Sullivan and Cromwell had actually set up the International Nickel Company. They had created that company as a global cartel. And they essentially merged IG Farben into that cartel. And despite warnings from other Western powers like Great Britain and Canada, Sullivan and Cromwell ensured IG Farben gained access to the nickel that helped build the German war machine in the interwar period. So they represented IG Farben. And if you know anything about like World War II, IG Farben was the manufacturer of Zyklon B, and it was probably the most powerful corporation in Germany at the time. And pretty much you see tons of IG Farben executives being tried at Nuremberg. Many of those executives were found guilty. They were convicted, but their sentences were lightened. And that was due in part to Alan Dulles, also John McCloy, who was kind of the de facto king of West Germany, following World War II. But IG Farben, I really encourage people, if they don't know a lot about that company, to kind of look into the history. It's really revealing that Sullivan and Cromwell represented them, and they, were funneling money and resources into the company.
Right. I mean, it just shows like this cross-national, trade going on. It goes all the way through. Like there's all kinds of intermediaries. Dulles is a member of the Knights of Malta. So is Himmler. All these other guys. Schacht is like an incredible figure. Like, but close to Hitler too. Like these guys are all adjacent to Hitler. It's really
Schacht ended up leading the Reichsbank, and I think he was like known as Hitler's economist. So it's not like they were, kind of supporting like peripheral figures of the Nazi regime. It's not like they were kind of like involved in low-level business. No, they were representing IG Farben. They were representing Ford, General Motors, all of these companies. And then, their point people were, people like Hjalmar Schacht, who was, known as Hitler's economist. And so that will it's critical to understand kind of those pre-war connections, because then when you look at something like paperclip, it begins to make a lot more sense. It's like it's not like it's in a vacuum. There are all of these relationships that extend deeper into history than just 1939 to 1945. And so yeah, so they represented IG Farben. The other one that was extremely terrible was Krupp, which is Krupp Steel, which was the German steelmaker and arms manufacturer. So Sullivan and Cromwell floated the first American bonds issued by the German steelmaker and arms manufacturer Krupp AG, and fought successfully to block Canada's effort to restrict the export of steel to German arms makers. So Krupp Steel was the main arms manufacturer in Germany, and they, helped ensure that they could get the steel into Germany, despite all of the Treaty of Versailles restrictions on, raw materials going into the country. And Krupp was an absolutely atrocious corporation, and I think they said that there's some reports that say like 80,000 slave laborers died under like the supervision of Krupp arms manufacturing during the war. So yeah, terrible, terrible stuff. And then Krupp, I think, is one of the same, like in that same category of IG Farben executives who gets his sentence extremely lightened, and they returned all of his assets after the war. And so he, faces no real consequences for, his role in building up the war machine. But that just gives you a pretty good overview of those pre-war connections. As early as 1933, right up until Sullivan and Cromwell had to close their Berlin office, the communications out of Germany ended with Heil Hitler. So it's like when the German office was corresponding with the office in New York, they had Heil Hitler at the bottom of their communications, and that was like the law of Germany in the time. But still, you would think that it didn't appear that John Foster or Allen really had any moral objections, to stuff like that. And they had actually, I believe it was either Allen or John Foster, had even had a meeting with Hitler in 1933, and they had kind of like published some. I think John Foster had published some stuff in some different newspapers that was kind of tacitly supporting the Hitler regime, saying that this is, kind of a defense. This is a great bulwark against, the incoming Soviet threat.
Communism, yeah, right after Hitler comes into power in 33, right?
Yeah, that was like, it was, and I think that's like, Schacht is right there. And then there's also something called the Bank of International Settlements, and there's Carl Blessing is one of their contacts. He ends up in the Reichsbank, not quite as high as Schacht gets, but right underneath there. Carl Blessing, his job was to incorporate the Austrian National Bank into the Reichsbank after the Anschluss, after Germany took Austria, kind of into the empire. And he's one of these people that later Alan Dulles helps get through the rat lines and helps him kind of get out of trouble. And Carl Blessing was able to keep. He was able to, he worked for. He was also on the board of, it was Continental Oil, I think is the translation to English. But yeah, Carl Blessing was on the board of Continental Oil, a monopoly created by IG Farben and private oil companies to seize control of petroleum firms in the newly conquered territories. So as they would go through and conquer, Eastern European countries, Western European countries, they would seize control of oil production, and that was the company responsible for seizing all of the petroleum. But yeah, after the war, Blessing was arrested. And while the Allied authorities considered charging him with war crimes, as he deserved, Allen Dulles also had Blessing in his sights. In the summer of 1945, the U.S. occupation authorities asked Dulles to provide white lists of suitable candidates for posts in the new German administration. Dulles provided an A list and a B list. The A list included Ernst Holz, former head of the Bank of International Settlements, But then Blessing's name was the first name on the B list, and Dulles termed him a prominent businessman and financial expert with considerable experience in international trade. And yeah, because he was on the B list that Alan Dulles wrote, Blessing faced no consequences. He was able to work for his former employer Unilever, and he would go on to work in positions at the Bundesbank, which was the successor to the Reichsbank. Died, a rich man. And so, like I said, it's not like these are peripheral characters in the Nazi government. They're very high ranking. And the other guy that was part of the Bank of International Settlements, the same bank that Blessing, had been involved with, it was Thomas McKittrick. And Thomas McKittrick and Alan Dulles are the ones that kind of hatched this rat line plan to get the financiers out of Nazi Germany. So he was, I don't know if Alan Dulles was as responsible for like getting the scientists into the country. I think he worked a little bit on that, but he was more focused on getting the businessmen out. And so many of these Nazi financiers who had financed, the businesses that employed slave labor and, had run the concentration camps, these people were allowed to get away and actually able to retain, most of the wealth that they had accumulated, off the backs of the Jewish, prisoners. And so that's kind of who we're dealing with. And then, I guess before we get kind of into like more of that, I found it really interesting. So in 1938, it was becoming very apparent of like what the Nazi government represented. And Alan Dulles actually had to convince John Foster to close the Berlin office. And so they put it to a vote, and the board, and I'm pretty sure they had like Jewish, there were a couple like Jewish people that worked on the board who were just completely horrified with, these policies. But they put it to a vote, and the board, voted to close the Berlin office. And, the reports are that John Foster was extremely emotional. Some reports have him even like, the decision to close the Berlin office like brought him to tears. And so he felt very, he was very close with the, kind of the Nazi government and the, the business structure that was there. But the Alan Dulles, obviously, like I said, was kind of instrumental in freeing Nazi criminals. He worked closely with John McCloy. Like I said, Carl Blessing is only one of dozens, if not hundreds, of war criminals that Dulles helped escape Germany after the war and find cushy positions in both the American government and elsewhere. And then obviously Paperclip is well documented and is, kind of its own beast. But yeah, Dulles is right in the thick of that entire, the entire rat line story. And, kind of going off of that, Dulles, he was a major supporter of employing Reinhard Gehlen and the Gehlen organization, which was the Nazi intelligence apparatus. They were especially active in Eastern Europe. And so as he begins to pivot, Dulles the Dulles brothers are these people who, they start to pivot to the Cold War even before the World War II ends. So in 1944, it's like there's a significant portion of the U.S. military and the U.S. intelligence infrastructure that believes that the tanks are going to roll right through Berlin and go to the Eastern Front, and that there's going to be a showdown with the Soviets. And so they're kind of preparing for this. And so that's one of the reasons that that Alan wants to employ the Gehlen organization, is because they already have contacts set up throughout Eastern Europe. And, the Nazis have been fighting a war against the Soviets for years. And so he wants to, use them to his advantage. But the Gehlen organization would end up, using the CIA to accomplish their own ends in Eastern Europe. So it's like they're this rogue Nazi intelligence organization that exists after the war. And the other thing that I wanted to mention, this is an important part of, Alan Dulles' legacy that not a lot of people know about. So I mentioned that he was the OSS station chief in Bern. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt famously hated the Nazis. He famously made an alliance with the Soviet Union in order to defeat the Nazis. And so he had a policy of total surrender, that there would be no separate peace between the United States and Nazi Germany, that, he required complete surrender from Germany and the Nazi Party. Well, Allen Dulles went rogue, and he decided that he wanted to try and pursue a peace treaty, between the United States and Germany. To what he wanted to do, they wanted to get rid of Hitler, but they wanted to keep the infrastructure of the SS pretty much intact, so that they could kind of form an alliance against the Soviet Union. And so it's called Operation Sunrise, goes behind the back of the president, who is, the commander in chief, the, head of the executive branch, the head of the military, responsible for all wartime operations. He goes behind the back of FDR and tries to negotiate this peace deal with the SS. And he even gets involved with a rescue operation for a Nazi who had been captured in Italy. And so, near the end of the war, Dulles organized a rescue party to save ardent Nazi Karl Wolff in Italy. And he continued to pull strings. So they were successful, and, they sent kind of an OSS mission into Italy, and he had been surrounded by, I don't think they were communists. It was some faction in Italy that was kind of fighting against the Italian, the fascist government at the time. But Karl Wolff found himself kind of surrounded by enemies, and the OSS went in there and rescued him. And then he continued to pull strings in the post-war adjudication process and paved the way for Wolff to re-enter civilian business life and become exceedingly profitable. And so he tried to justify it. Allen Dulles tried to justify it. So Dulles's friend was Henry Luce, the owner of Time magazine, and they tried to put out a propaganda piece that said that this peace process was aimed at saving lives, like saving soldiers' lives, so that they didn't have to continue to roll through the Western Front. And he was trying to, put an early end to the war. It did not do that at all. But what it did do was it inflamed Stalin's paranoia about a Western alliance against the Soviet Union. And this really created one of the first major fissures in the Cold War. And so, as we know, kind of FDR died before the total end of World War II. But had FDR survived, people were saying, like, he believed that this was treason. And there's a strong possibility that Allen Dulles would have been arrested at the very least, and put on trial for, it's essentially what he was doing was committing treason, against the United States government.
Right, he was just doing an end around, right? He was friends with Wolff. Wolff was the guy, I think, in northern Italy, and he was like close friends with Hitler. Like, he's not far away from Hitler. The other interesting thing is, like, he was the point person for the plot to kill Hitler in 1944 too. So he had this very intimate relationship with the Nazis, good or bad, whatever.
Well, that's what, that was part of that, like the peace process that he was negotiating was through Wolff, of that plan to kind of kill Hitler, but keep the rest of the Nazi government kind of intact. And so that was what, Allen Dulles, that was the plan that they had kind of been working on. And, I guess in the middle of that plan, Wolff got captured. But Wolff was the primary, before he kind of had this split with Hitler. I think it was just Wolff saw the writing on the wall and, knew that the Nazis weren't going to win. And so he wanted to do the best he could to salvage the rest of the Nazi movement. But previous to that, he was the main, like Germany's main ambassador to Italy and to Mussolini. There's pictures of Wolff with like Mussolini and Hitler on those trips.
Yeah, it's after they got rescued Mussolini, Otto Skorzeny, then they set up the rump state of Salo in northern Italy. And I think Wolff was involved in that too. So it's, and this is like, stone's throw from where he is in Switzerland. So crazy history. Like, some of this stuff was really lost. before leading up all the way up to Kennedy administration, his involvement in JFK. Like this guy had a storied career for decades. Both of them really. But I think John Foster died, I think, in late 50s, right?
Yeah,
I
so
remember.
we'll get into like the kind of their roles in the Eisenhower administration. So John Foster, like I said, he was kind of a businessman at heart. And when you hear a lot of the stuff about Sullivan and Cromwell, that's kind of John Foster's gig, is like he's kind of the head honcho at Sullivan and Cromwell, and he's the one organizing all of these business deals with these German corporations. And Allen is working on that too, but kind of he's not as high up in the company. Um, but then when you get into kind of post-war, like organizing rat lines and stuff like that, and when you get into like a lot of this intelligence activity, that's where Allen starts to really like enter the picture much more forcefully. And so after the war, Allen Dulles, John Foster returns to Sullivan and Cromwell, and he becomes he wants to get much more involved in kind of like, your standard politics. And he really throws his weight behind the Dewey campaign. And so that was the Republican candidate for president who was running against Truman. And a lot of people thought that Dewey was going to win. Truman was not the most popular president. Even the Democrats really didn't like Truman. But Truman kind of had a bit of a shock upset. And but Dewey had promised John Foster that he was going to be the Secretary of State for his administration should he win. And so, John Foster was becoming more involved in kind of your standard Republican politics, while Allen was really behind the scenes pushing for the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency. So the Central Intelligence Agency was chartered in 1947, and there was a big fight behind the scenes of how powerful the CIA was going to be, because Truman originally wanted it just to be an intelligence collection organization that provided intelligence to the Joint Chiefs of Staff and wasn't able to really act on the intelligence, that the Joint Chiefs of Staff would make decisions about the intelligence being provided, and that they would be the ones to kind of call the shots based on, whatever the CIA collected. Whereas Allen Dulles wanted a much more powerful organization that both collected the intelligence and acted on the intelligence. And so, there's all of this. The Red Scare really begins to pick up. There's some things that happen in Czechoslovakia. There are communists, there's activity down in Latin America. Colombia is a hotspot. And so as, kind of this Red Scare really begins to take hold of the country, that's how Allen Dulles uses the fear of communism to really work behind the scenes and help create a very strong Central Intelligence Agency that has a lot of authority and jurisdiction to kind of work. And so he, is successful in kind of pushing through his vision for the CIA in 1947. But as I said, Truman wins, so they have to kind of wait until they officially, get into positions of power. And that would come with the Eisenhower administration. And so under the Eisenhower administration, who, I believe is a Republican, John Foster Dulles is able to secure the Secretary of State position, kind of following in the footsteps of his grandfather and his uncle. And he's really like a leader in anti-communist rhetoric and anti-communist policy. And so he has a very aggressive attitude towards the Soviet Union. So later there would be kind of a policy of containment. There would be kind of a policy of a lot of people would be pushing for kind of like peace with the Soviet Union instead of trying to get into an active war. Whereas John Foster, this is early Cold War, early Eisenhower administration, he is taking a much more aggressive policy, and it's called rollback of communism. And so he's wanting to actually engage with communist countries, like engage with communist governments and kind of like more formal conflict, more formal kind of war.
Brinkmanship, they call it brinkmanship too. Take it to the top.
Yeah, and he also, he's a believer in what it was like, basically total, like, massive retaliation. So
more bang for the buck, tons of nuclear missiles, the whole bit. It's all Dulles,
Yeah, and so that's John Foster Dulles, and he's writing all of these things in the media. He's a big, he's writing all these editorials and different stuff like that. And so he gets into the Secretary of State, and during the Eisenhower administration, obviously you have kind of the Korean War, some of the major early conflicts, really, really terrifying time, to be an American, and it really sets the stage for, kind of the Cuban Missile Crisis that you see later in the JFK administration. This period of like, you're on the seat of your pants thinking that a nuclear war could erupt at any time. And it's like the Dulles brothers, they believe that annihilation of the species, like annihilation of humanity, is better than humanity falling under a communist rule. Like, they don't think life is worth living under a communist regime, so you might as well just wipe everyone off the planet instead of letting that happen. So yeah, he's Secretary of State, and then he ends up getting sick. I think he gets sick during the second Eisenhower administration, and has to kind of leave his office of Secretary of State, and then he ends up dying in the late 50s. But Alan Dulles has kind of a crazy, while he's the director of the CIA under Eisenhower, has a crazy series of events that he overseas. And so I guess it really kind of starts with Iran. Like, that's probably the first formal, engagement with, trying to overthrow a foreign government that Alan gets involved with. And so in Iran, it was the nationalization of oil that threatened the West the most. Iran was a country that had largely been controlled by British petroleum interests over the years and the decades kind of leading up to World War II. But the Iranian people had grown tired of foreign influence over their nation's economy, and they sought a leader who would protect their national interests from hawkish Western companies. And so Mossadegh was this leader. He was democratically elected to lead Iran in the early 1950s. He was not a communist, but of course the CIA and others smeared him as one. He was more of an Iranian nationalist who had a few socialist policies, but mainly he just wanted to nationalize the country's resources and take the oil out of the hands of the West and put it in the hands of Iran. But they smear him as a communist. They send Kermit Roosevelt, who was it FDR's nephew. He was, in the Roosevelt line.
Kermit Roosevelt, yeah.
And they send him over there, and Dulles and the British are obviously, because it's, the British oil interests that are most at stake in this. The British, they don't have the same kind of power that they did, previous to World War II. And so they have to rely on the United States to kind of execute this coup. But the CIA is working very closely with British intelligence. And so they wage a propaganda campaign at Mossadegh in the United States, and they paint him out to be a terrorist puppet of Moscow. The Shah, who had been kind of in control of the country before Mossadegh had been elected, the Shah had fled the country, and he was shopping with his wife in Rome when the CIA put their coup into action. So the Shah was kind of this flamboyant, kind of rich leader, like much more interested in traveling, much more interested in shopping in Rome than he was in leading a country. But the CIA, they paid crowds to tear up the streets. So literally these rioters would have CIA cash in their pockets, like falling out of their pockets as they're swelling into the streets. And the CIA created an inorganic uprising against Mossadegh, who was unable or unwilling to use sufficient force to put it down. So he would not kind of turn his military against his own people. And the rioters eventually stormed the presidential palace with CIA tanks and weapons, and they captured Mossadegh. And he was eventually exiled to a small village, and the Shah was reinstalled on the peacock throne. And this ensured that Western oil companies got their sweetheart deals. And instead of the British really reaping the rewards, it was kind of American petroleum interests that really profited from it. So I think they put BP, like British Petroleum, kind of back in the driver's seat, but we got 40% of the profits from, that oil. So that was a huge deal. This was seen as like a massive success by Dulles, but as we will see, the Shah's government was completely inept, and this leads directly to the 1979 Iranian Revolution, led by religious radicals, that was successful in overthrowing the government and has been, a pain in the United States. Has been a thorn in our side ever since. In the history of the CIA in Iran, throughout is, fascinating. It's also horrific, but right after that Iranian Revolution, there would be the Iran-Iraq War, where we funded both sides. All of these terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda that you see, that's where you start to see kind of United States funding. Following that, you have the Gulf War. And so it's just this story. And then obviously 9/11 happens, the Middle Eastern wars happen. Iran continues to be, an area of, serious threat and conflict today. And so that's, you kind of see what happens when you begin to topple governments and when you begin to overthrow leaders. There are unintended consequences that show up and reverberate, throughout history. And that really starts with Allen Dulles in 1953 is when that happened.
Yeah, it swung back, right? So they took it over in 53, and then the people of Iranians took it back in 79 in the Islamic Revolution. So it's Shah Rez Pahlavi, I think was his name, right? Isn't that the Shah?
Yeah.
They're trying to reinstall his son too. Like, it's still around. So the Pahlavi regime is still being floated around. He was being put on TV, I think, until recently as like a potential thing if they overthrew the current government, which the U.S. was involved in, recently killing off 1,400 people. But that was this year, so still happening.
Yeah, I mean, there's still, I was actually listening to a podcast with this guy named Jason Reza Georgiani, and he's like a big guy in like the UFO world, and he was on Jesse Michaels' American Alchemy. They did like 8 hours of podcasts, and, it's just one of those things that's, he's just one of these crazy individuals, but he is like Persian, kind of his bloodline is Persian, and he was talking about how he was involved in this movement, this Iranian, quote unquote, Iranian people's movement to kind of topple the government, topple the current regime from within, and he was seeking allies and intelligence organizations and stuff like that. And so they're still very active and still very involved with trying to oust the current regime, whether it's through, they haven't obviously, maybe they've tried outright assassination, but, they're trying to make it appear as if, it's coming from within, which I do think the Iranians themselves are probably not very happy with their government, but that's a different story.
It's part of the destabilization the U.S. has been involved in, like the KO Americana. They call it a Pax Americana, but the U.S. has been involved in overthrowing and installing. And so many governments are really, they externally look like they're independent, but they're not. The U.S. has propped them up or manipulated people. Lumumba, Congo, Arbenz. We can just go into all that stuff.
Yeah, that's what. So the Guatemalan coup, like I said, that was kind of where I started in all of this journey. And that is, it's a terrible, terrible story. Extremely sad, as most of these stories are. But so it starts kind of in 1944. There is a leader of Guatemala who has been kind of in the pocket of United Fruit Company. And United Fruit Company had negotiated contracts with Jorge Ubico that gave them 40% of Guatemala's arable land. So 70% of the land in Guatemala was owned by 2% of the population, and that 2% of the population was basically representing the interests of United Fruit Company. They owned all of the railways in Guatemala. They owned the only Atlantic port in Guatemala. They owned the telecommunications company in Guatemala. So this was basically a corporation that had a state within a state. They were, probably even more powerful than the Guatemalan government was itself. And like I said, the law firm that represented United Fruit Company and negotiated all of these contracts was Sullivan and Cromwell. And Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles had helped to negotiate those contracts. And so in 1944, this is like right before World War II ends. The United States doesn't quite have the time to check in on everything happening in every country in the world. And so Guatemala is actually able to hold elections for, I think, one of the first times in their history, like a real election. And they elect a guy named Jose Arevalo. And Jose Arevalo ushers in what's called the 10 years of springtime in Guatemala. And he is kind of a socialist reformer. And he's much more, he's interested in doing things like building public schools, building hospitals. He's interested in providing social services because Guatemala was and still is one of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere. And it was just setting up basic social services, to try and help the impoverished people. So under United Fruit Company, they had basically a debt slavery system. Jorge Ubico, the guy before Arevalo, the dictator who had set up all the deals with United Fruit Company, he referred to the indigenous peasantry as like beasts of burden. And so they would chain, these peasants together, and they would force them to work in the fields, and they would put them into debt, similar to kind of like the sharecropping arrangement in the southern United States following the Civil War.
They're all indigenous too. So they're all indigenous Maya. That's a very important component.
Yes, so they are
Western media.
Yeah, they are Guatemala. I'm not sure if they are still majority indigenous. They might
50,
be, but
50,
they're
I think, pretty close.
Yeah, but they were the last remaining indigenous majority country in the Western Hemisphere. Like they were the ones that had the most remaining indigenous people. And so these people that they have in debt slavery are all indigenous, extremely poor. They would live up in the mountains during the winter, barely surviving, barely able to farm enough food for themselves. And then during the growing and harvest season, they would be, like I said, chained together, forced to work on these banana plantations. And then it was, kind of that same situation where the only supplies that they could buy, the only food that they could buy was from company stores, and the company stores would jack up the prices so that every single penny that they earned had to be spent, at the company store. And then even they would run into debt, because they wouldn't have enough money to afford that kind of stuff. So terrifying, horrible conditions. And this is, the United States is the main importer of bananas. So all of these bananas that we're getting for, extremely cheap, I'm sure they were, it was like a cent for a banana back then, it's coming from, coming from this system. So anyways, Arevalo comes in 1944. He starts to build schools, hospitals, stuff like that. But the one thing that he will not do is he will not pursue land reform, because he knows how powerful United Fruit Company is. And he knows that if you take them on, that there's a strong possibility that they're going to fight back. So his successor is a guy named Jacobo Arbenz. And Jacobo Arbenz was, he was actually descended from kind of a richer class. His father was Swiss. And then his mother, I think his mother was Guatemalan or something like that. But he came from a wealthier family. He was an officer in the Guatemalan military, and he married the daughter of a poppy farmer in like a poppy plantation owner in El Salvador. And they were kind of like these a little bit rebel children, and they kind of went against their upbringing and had, an affinity towards the indigenous people of Guatemala. And so they become reformers. And Jacobo Arbenz is the one that pursues land reform. And so and this is where there's a lot of propaganda that happens. A lot of people say that he just nationalized the land and that he seized it from United Fruit Company. That's not what he did. So he purchased the land from United Fruit Company that they were not cultivating. So he didn't interfere with any of their current financial operations. He was interfering with their future plans to cultivate land. So it was land that literally nobody was working. And he did not seize the land. He paid United Fruit Company the amount that they valued the land when they were paying taxes. And so they would pay the Guatemalan government taxes, but they were only paying taxes at like a hugely discounted rate. And so they were claiming that the land was worth like $2 million. So only paying like a couple $100,000 in taxes, when in reality, the land is closer to $20 million. And so he pays them what they had been claiming on their taxes. And obviously that is like, far short of what they really valued the land at. And so they say that he came in and stole their land. But that's what he did. Same story with kind of like what Mossadegh did with the oil in Iran, trying to take their resources out of the hand of Western foreign powers and put it back into the hand of the Guatemalan people. He starts to hand out the land. And this is unacceptable to United Fruit Company. And so they were able to call on Alan Dulles and John Foster Dulles, who, like I said, had worked as lawyers for the company. And since Alan Dulles was the director of the CIA and John Foster Dulles was the Secretary of State, they hatched Operation PB Success. And Operation PB Success was a coup, and the Somoza dictatorship, the right-wing dictatorship in Nicaragua, met with officials in Washington and said, hey, if you give me arms and we set up an arms deal, I would be happy to provide, a training ground and like a base of operations for this coup. So Washington takes him up on this offer, and they use elements of the Guatemalan military that were not particularly happy with Jacobo Arbenz. And they roll into Guatemala and they oust Arbenz and exile him. So he goes to Mexico. He ends up in a bunch of different places. They ruin his life. And so kind of surprising that, he didn't end up committing suicide, because he was in really, really bad shape for the rest of his life. But they install a dictator called Colonel Castillo Armas. And immediately they start putting together a blacklist of political opponents. And that blacklist grew to 70,000 names, which, and eventually grew to 10% of the adult population in Guatemala. And these people were not communists, like the CIA was saying. There was only a few thousand communists in Guatemala. They had never heard of Karl Marx. They really didn't pay attention to anything in the Soviet Union, but they did, believe in democracy and the need for land reform for the peasantry. But they had something called Decree 59, created a fascist police state in Guatemala. It allowed for the people on the blacklist to be arrested and held without trial. They were tortured by a guy named Judge Linares and others, and the CIA actually put together torture manuals for the Guatemalan fascist police. They instructed the fascist police and the military in torture methods and trained them on how to inflict not only the most physical pain, but the psychological warfare components of, kind of these death squads. When you read accounts of, the experiences of the Guatemalan people, especially like the Guatemalan indigenous people, you can see that there is an element of psychological. It is, to invoke the most fear possible. And that is using, extremely brutal, extremely savage, methods of torture and killing. There's a book called I, Rigoberta Menchú. And Rigoberta Menchú was involved in activism among the indigenous peasantry and with the communists in the 70s and 80s. But she escaped, and she talks about just some of the most terrible things you'll ever read that happened to, her brother. And they would do these public executions where they would, torture these young boys for, 7 days before bringing them in front of their families. And then they would, continue to torture them in front of their families and, burn them alive. So stuff like that is what the CIA was kind of, training these death squads to do. But Castillo Armas, when this is 54, 55, 56, there's a succession of right-wing dictators that we support. And what it does is it sparks the civil war. So before, there is not really a communist presence in Guatemala, but afterwards, many people who are against this right-wing government think that the only way to fight against them is to support a communist revolution. And so a communist revolution does bubble up, and it starts a civil war that lasts for, I think, 36 years. And at the end of it, I think around 250,000 to 300,000 people, mostly the indigenous Maya, end up dead. There was a genocide that happened. So the communists, their strategy was at first, they tried to kind of take the government head on. They got absolutely wiped off the map. And so they had to kind of recede back into the jungle and go on kind of one of those Mao, kind of long marches. And then their strategy was like, well, we need to recruit the support of the indigenous Maya. We can't do this without the support of the people. And so the communists, try to start making alliances with the indigenous Maya, and the indigenous Maya are very hesitant to enter into an alliance with the communists because they know how brutal the government can be. But eventually they do, because conditions are so bad. And in response, the Guatemalan government is this guy named Efrain Rios Montt, and this was during the Reagan administration. But Efrain Rios Montt starts a scorched earth genocide campaign where he just tells his soldiers to go slaughter entire villages, men, women, and children. And that it's like the famous quote of, to get the fish, you have to drain the lake. And so he saw the lake as the indigenous people and the communists as the fish. And so, he tried to drain the lake by just indiscriminately murdering 200,000 indigenous people in the years of, kind of 1980 to 1985, 86, before there was a peace treaty signed. But you see, so going back to Operation PB success, you see like these figures like Richard Bissell, Tracy Barnes, Howard Hunt, David Phillips, David Morales, some of these people that'll pop back up and, all of this CIA history, this JFK stuff, Bay of Pigs, they're the ones who are organizing the coup down there. And and
the psychological operations and all the stuff that was done. I think it was Bissell or one of the other guys, like David Atlee Phillips, was doing the stuff. This is an interesting picture of kind of symbolizing what went on in Guatemala. It's by the great Diego Rivera, and it shows Castillo Armas. He's the guy in the red, so he's the one who's like getting the handouts from the gringos, and he's making a pact with none other than U.S. Ambassador to Guatemala, John Puigfroy, and then John Foster Dulles and his brother, CIA Director Alan Dulles. And Alan Dulles is kind of depicted as this black figure with money in a satchel whispering in his brother's ear. And then the bomb is face alluding to President Eisenhower. In the background is shown a United Fruit Company ship exporting bananas, as well as the figure of Archbishop Mariano Russell A. Arellano officiating a mass over the massacred bodies of the workers. And then Castillo Armas would lead the overthrow of our Benz. So you never see this in the Western press. It's just another like thing.
Yeah, and then just to to iterate is United Fruit Company, kind of in the middle of this, felt the need for a bit of a rebranding, and United Fruit Company became Chiquita Banana. So Chiquita Banana is still, and you will still, every single time I get a banana, 9 times out of 10, it has Guatemala as the country of origin. So
they rebranded it and put on a nice corporate, advertising campaign, like to cover up this massive genocide. Not that far away from the United States. We're at the 90-minute mark. I think I got to break it off here. We'll have to do another part 2 sometime, maybe in 2026. But where can people find your stuff, David?
Yeah. Check out Bad Press is the podcast that we have, trying to get more episodes out, talking about kind of the same type of stuff on this podcast. Some different subjects as well. And then we also have a Substack that Bad Press is affiliated with. It is called Hemispheric Press. And under the Bad Press page, you can find write-ups about, we're doing the Puharch series. I'm still doing the Epstein series that we had. There's a lot of different kind of stuff. Probably going to do a write-up of the Dulles because I have 8 pages of notes from this interview. And yeah, a lot of cool stuff. My business partner has a couple books out. Shroud Pilled is one about the Shroud of Turin. He also has another book called God's Eye View. Please buy those. We've got a coloring book. It's the ABCs of conspiracy coloring. So it's just kind of like a joke, good gag gift if you're looking for a last minute Christmas gift for your crazy conspiracy uncle. Like J is for the JFK assassination, stuff like that. And then we have another coloring book kind of coming out. So we're doing a few different things, just kind of throwing spaghetti at the wall, but just trying to make it happen. So really appreciate any support.
Yeah, I'll put a link to Bad Press podcast on here. People follow through. What's your business partner's name again?
Trevor Lohman. So Lohman. Yeah. So he is a neuroscientist. God's Eye View talks about the physics of consciousness and kind of how quantum physics, has really led to some fascinating insights into the study of consciousness. And then, like I said, Shroud Pilled is about how maybe the Shroud of Turin is a little bit more real than people ever gave it credit for, and how interesting some of the scientific studies into that have been. So,
right on. Again, the guest name is David Smith, and it's Bad Press podcast. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. We talked about the Dulles brothers. There's a lot to talk about. So, thanks everybody. Everybody have a great holiday season. Thank you.
Yeah.